here's a thought for you.
hmm
So one of the core, and I'm delighted to be talking to you, right? My dear colleague and friend, and who's, we've studied together for, Zach started studying with me 12 years ago. And we've done a very deep dive over the last 12 years. So Zach spoke very highly of you. And so
Mm.
I'm delighted to be here and to be with you and to be in your space. So thank you for the honor and the privilege. And one of the things we forget online is honor, right? That
Mm.
as I'm stepping in your living room, right? And so I get to kind of bow and give you honor in your living room and in your space. So thank you. And in terms of a sentence, let me give you, I'm going to put 3 sentences in the space with permission, and then you can find our way.
Perfect.
So the basic premise that we're operating with at the center, in the center, I founded with my dear friend Ken Wilber back in 2009. We founded it as the Center for World Spirituality. It then evolved to the Center for Integral Wisdom. And it's finally doing a third evolution as it's sharpening its focus. And we're calling it the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. And Ken and I have remained, in deep, kind of contact at probably the last decade. We spoke almost every Monday, for a bunch of time and just, talked about life and Dharma. And so we've done a great dive together. Zach has been a key, partner, interlocutor, student, friend, co-president now. And we've done what we call Holy of Holies, right? Which is a kind of every week deep dive study for maybe 12 years, a long time. And we've tried to articulate what we're calling cosmoerotic humanism. And cosmoerotic humanism is something like, just to give us a frame, something like existentialism or romanticism, meaning it's a meta-theory of meta-theories of meta-theories that integrates an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of meta-theories into what I would call second simplicity, right? Into a kind of simplicity, on the other side of complexity, in order to tell the best story we can about what it means to be a human being, with the premise that we're living in a time between worlds. We're living at what Zach and I call a time between worlds, a time between stories. And in the space in between, in the Ark of the Covenant and the temple in Jerusalem, the voice of prophecy came from the space in between the cherubs. So in this liminal space, in this time between worlds and time between stories, we're actually facing a meta crisis, a poly crisis. And at the core of the poly crisis, underneath everything, underneath the generator functions that, we've talked about a lot, Zach and I, and we're actually writing entire books on, and myself and Zach and our brother Daniel talked a lot about the generator functions of win-lose metrics governing rivalrous conflict as one generator function, and a second generator function is that rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics generates what Taleb calls fragile systems or complicated, not complex systems. But underneath that, and myself and Barbara Marks Hubbard, who was with us last 5 years of her life and a co-president at the center, we talked a lot about these issues. But underneath all that, there's actually a loss of intimacy. And intimacy is about enchantment. Intimacy is about being alive. There's what I would call, Daniel, a global intimacy disorder, which is the root cause of the meta crisis underneath the formal generator functions. So I just want to notice what we just did, because we just did a lot. Meaning if we cut through all the news and we actually energize and synergize, we integrate and synergize all the information available, we can identify these 2 generator functions: rivalrous conflict, win-lose metrics, generating complicated, fragile, not complex systems. That's a big discussion. But let's go underneath that now. But underneath those generator functions, there's a root cause, and the root cause is a global intimacy disorder. And a global intimacy disorder is always rooted in a collapse of shared story, but not just shared story. That's not enough. There's been, since the mid-60s, there's been a conversation which you can trace intellectually of news story. It's not just news story, because news story could be conjecture or declaration. It's a new story of, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, it's a new story of value rooted in evolving first principles and first values. So that's a big sentence. A new story of value rooted in evolving first principles and first values, and we call that evolving perennialism. But I'm going to bracket all of that. I'm going to bracket all of that, just our context. That's bracket, 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 bracket. That's context. So now I want to answer the question. Let's give us a sentence we can locate in. But to start the sentence without a frame is wildly irresponsible and non-erotic and non-intimate. So we have a frame. We can live in that frame. So what I want to suggest is 3 sentences, which is a beautiful way in. Sentence 1. Every generation articulates a vision mediated through its own consciousness of the infinite, of the divine. Now, when we say the divine, let's just say in parentheses, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. In other words, so everyone has a God they don't believe in, right? My mother was, chasing me, and I went into the bathroom and I shut the door, and my mother said, "God's going to get you in there." And then that remains the image of God for the rest of my life. The God you don't believe in, that God doesn't exist. And that's why Abraham Cook, one of my teachers, talked about heresy, which is faith. Meaning you deny the God that you don't believe in. So let's take that out of the picture, okay? Take that, anyone listening, all your issues with God, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. Fuck it, let it go, okay? But now in a clarified way, how do we find the intimate? So I want to offer essentially a new name of God. Because actually, when we actually articulate a new name of God, we change something essential in the very source code of consciousness. So I want to suggest a name of God, which is the infinite intimate. It's very beautiful. The infinite intimate. Meaning we're talking about God not as the infinity only of power, not of the infinity of power only, which is how the classical systems understood the divine, based on first and second person realization experiments in what I would call the interior sciences. Right? They came to this conclusion, divinity is the infinity of power. So there's truth in that. That's important. But that divinity, which is the infinity of power that doesn't live just outside of reality, but is inherent, the incessant creative process with its infinity of power, that's insufficient. When you actually meditate more deeply, when you actually practice more deeply, you actually have a realization of divinity as the infinity of intimacy. It's like, the infinity of intimacy. And the infinity of intimacy yearns for, needs, desires, in Whitehead's phrase, because he was an Englishman, he talked about appetition, right? You can't say things like desire when you're in Cambridge, England in 1910, right? There's an appetite in cosmos for value, and the core of value in Whitehead's image, for example, is beauty. But what he means by beauty is goodness and truth, which includes more and more and more contradictions. But if you actually get underneath that, and here I'm already not drawing from Whitehead, I'm drawing from an integration of all the interior sciences that I've been able to read over the last 40 years in a kind of second simplicity sentence. Infinity yearns for intimacy. It's such a shocking idea when Schelling asked, why is there something rather than nothing? Like, what the fuck? That's the what the fuck question, right? Why are we here? Why are Daniel and Mark talking to each other? When you actually go deep into the structure of cosmos, which lives inside of you, meaning anthro-ontologically, anthro, human being, ontology, for realsies, right? A loose definition of ontology, but meaning it's really true. So anthro, there's something that Zach and I are calling the anthro-ontological method, meaning the mysteries are within us. I participate in the field of value, which is reality. And so therefore, by a clarified investigation of my own interiors, I actually eavesdrop on the infinite. Wow. That's an incredibly important epistemological statement without which we can't actually reconstruct value. But let's bracket that for a second. When I eavesdrop, right, and I say, Daniel, what are you looking for, brother? Right? What's driving you? Right? Underneath everything, right? We have this enormous desire for intimacy, right? To transcend, to end the trance of the sense of being separate or lonely, right? Or alienated. We want to actually experience intimacy. And intimacy means something. We'll get that maybe a little later. Zach and I have created 18 equations in the interior sciences that we're actually about to publish, which define the cosmos, interior and exterior. And one of them is what we call the intimacy equation. So let's bracket that for a second. But for now, let's just use the word elusively, right? Intimacy, right? And it's the infinite desires intimacy. And how do you know? Because here we are, right? In Kashmir Shaivism, they talk about, in Abhinavagupta, in Kashmir Shaivism, which is a root tradition for Hinduism, they talk about the stirring of desire in the infinite. So that stirring of desire that lives in Mark, that lives in my friend Ken Wilber, that lives in Zach, that lives in Daniel, that stirring of desire participates in the field of desire and consciousness because there is no local desire. People generally self-pathologize based on their desire or their desire patterns. That's a larger conversation, and we've lost access to a narrative of desire. But just in one sentence, desire participates in the field of desire. So Daniel is a unique configuration of desire, an irreducibly unique configuration of desire, which is not just his attachment patterns that went wrong, with all due respect to my friend Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk. It's not just that. It's not formed in this kind of quasi-materialist, assumption, it's all formed in the first 3 years. I'm a much wider field in the first 3 years, right? So who's Daniel? Daniel's an irreducibly unique configuration of desire who participates in the field of desire of reality, and actually reality desires through Danielness. And reality experiences its own shocking self-recognition through the interior quality of Daniel's desire. And at the core of Daniel's desire is a desire for intimacy, whether in the form of goodness, participating in value, whether in the form of truth, whether in the form of beauty, right? We desire intimacy. We desire to actually not be alienated from. So divinity is the infinite intimate, not only the infinity of power, but the infinity of intimacy. And then last sentence, and what drives evolution is the progressive deepening of intimacies. Wow. So we used to think about evolution. I was sitting with my dear colleague, Irvin Laszlo. He invited me to come visit him at his house in Tuscany a bunch of years ago. And Barbara, Mark Hubbard, had actually set up the conversation. And we started talking, and I said to Irvin, okay, so what drives evolution? Well, he's a good systems theorist, simplicity to complexity. And so I said, well, okay, what's the interior of complexity? Well, so we start talking complexity is interconnectivity. What's the interior of interconnectivity? Intimacy, right? Interconnectivity is an exterior. The interior of interconnectivity is intimacy. That is to say, and this is the book that Zach and I are now completing called The Intimate Universe. So in other words, evolution is the evolution of intimacy. And I participate uniquely in the infinite intimate. Wow. So that's maybe a place to start. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's actually, it's perfect because the sentence that I was going to suggest is a compression of where you landed, which is that the universe is a love story. And I want to summarize some of the things you said just so the listeners have like a couple ways to interpret that, beautiful rhizomatic structure you put out.
Totally summarize. Let's do a bracket. So just so we get the bracket and then it's all yours. As you know, the universe : a love story is one of the major memes of cosmologic humanism. So the universal love story, or I'll just give you universe : a love story, which is the title of 5 volumes we're putting out now called the universal love story, or the cosmoerotic universe, or the intimate universe, or the amorous cosmos, or evolution : the love story of the universe. Those are the 6 ways we talk about it.
Yeah.
And they're all inter-included. Take it away, brother.
Okay. Let me try my best to
my mother said I was too much. So get it. My mom said, Mark, you're just too much. So I apologize. Take it away.
So, okay. So the stakes are high. First thing you said, the stakes are high. we are facing the polycrisis. There's all sorts of difficult existential risks that humanity is facing, and the future of humanity depends on some form of collective intelligence that might come from self-organizing and facing the crisis intelligently. One way to put this is we have exponential technology increasing our capacity for power without increasing our wisdom and our love. And you're saying that underneath all that, there's different generator functions like rivalrous dynamics, but underneath all of that is this failure of intimacy. And at the same time, there's a hopeful piece, which is that actually the nature of the universe, the nature of the cosmos is something like, now these are my words, but God in the process of knowing itself, God in the process of becoming increasingly intimate with itself.
It's good to do one step in between. Fantastic. Gorgeous. One step in between. In the global intimacy disorder, we said we said like 10 volumes in 3 sentences, so you're totally right. The global intimacy disorder is based on a collapse of a shared story of value.
Yes.
Right? And that shared story of value, now let's construct the shared story of value. The shared story of value is the story of cosmoerotic humanism, which is the story of the intimate universe, which is the story of evolution, which is evolution not merely as simplicity to complexity, but evolution, brother, as the progressive deepening of intimacies. Fair?
Yes. And I'll add one more thing.
I mean, please.
I'll add one more thing so you said something about, you used this analogy of like interior versus exterior, interior science or exterior science. And just so we don't lose some of the listeners with that, the way I understand this, and maybe you can even sharpen my thinking on this, it's the difference between the subjective experience of a meditator, someone who's meditating, and them actually having a change in their phenomenology, versus what shows up in the MRI as they're being studied while meditating. So the MRI would be the exterior, and the interior is the subjective experience. But you're extending that all the way down to the fundamental nature of reality, the subatomic particles, the ontological truths at the basis of everything.
Right. No, so beautiful, beautiful, Daniel. Let's play with it for a second. So one, it's a great example of interiors and exteriors, right? So there's the, phenomenological experience of the meditator, meaning the way the meditator feels on the inside. And then there's the MRI, or let's make it even simpler. Let's go for second simplicity, right? Because not everyone has access to the experience of meditation, but we've all tried to love, right? Successfully or unsuccessfully. So the interior experience of being in love, right? So right now, I'm loving Daniel. I said, wow, this is this new dude. I haven't talked to him before. We just talked for a few minutes, and I'm enjoying his quality. And, I feel this kind of like, I'm curious. I want to hear more, right? My heart's opening. So that's an interior experience, because love's not just romantic love. Love's a much wider field. So the interior experience is love. But now if we chart that, you'd probably see in my mind, and maybe in your mind, a whole host of neurochemicals, right, that are exploding, right? So neurochemicals, exterior, in love, eros, is not reducible to neurochemicals, as, by the way, I've read 1,000 articles, which I've actually collected, right, which talk about love and elliptically imply that it's actually just neurochemicals when it's not. It's the exterior and the interior. But let me, if I can throw in a new word that Zach and I have kind of, coined in cosmoerotic humanism, we talk about pan-interiority. It's a nice word, pan-interiority. Right? In other words, that reality is actually interiors and exteriors, all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. So it's all interiors and exteriors, very far down and all the way up. And so I then, based on that, coined another term called the interior sciences. And the reason I started talking about the interior sciences, because when I say mysticism, people get lost. Yeah, mysticism sounds, somehow quasi, pseudo, right? When you say interior sciences, what you manage to do in one linguistic move is to actually convey that actually there's gravitas to this. And there's actually a process of experimentation and validation, right? And this is actually a very serious enterprise, and there's cross-cultural investigations that are now being brought together, and there's peer review in an implicit way throughout history. That's exciting, right? So there's exterior and interior sciences. And one of the things we're trying to do, brother, is really to kind of field a new language in cosmologic humanism, because it's only a new field of language embedded in one, language; two, first principles and first values; three, language and first principles and first values embedded in a story of value, that can actually shift where we're going. Meaning infrastructure won't address the meta crisis, and this is Harris's distinction, right? And social structure. So infrastructure means new ways of searching for bioweapons in the water, infrastructure, right? Or, an AI social structure would be, right, let's organize, an oversight body to actually guide AI and its unfolding. Artificial intelligence, that would be social structure. Those are both crazily important, of course. But, the premise of the think tank is it's not going to take us home. It's only if we directly affect superstructure, Harris's term, but I would call superstructure, again, in quotation marks, a new story of value. And that's what cosmologic humanism is. But here's the thing. It's a fucking love story, right? That's the crazy thing, right? In other words, the crazy thing is, and you said before we started, where's the enchantment? Which, and my whole heart lit up. And, I got to fall in love with you in 1 second. What a beautiful question before a podcast, right? Where's the enchantment? Like, so deepest bow, right? So here's the enchanted 3 sentences. Reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story. Reality is a love story. Reality is not an ordinary love story. Reality is an evolutionary story. Reality is an outrageous love story. And last sentence, and your love story is chapter and verse in the universe, a love story. So those 5 sentences are kind of a central sutra, if we can borrow that term from the Sanskrit. It's a central sutra. It's a central set of psukim in Hebrew, a set of verses in cosmologic humanism, which is the ground of a new global grammar of value. And here I want to say something a little bit radical, and I mean it tenderly, and I know there's going to be in your body a little jump, right? And I apologize somewhat insincerely for that, right? But we do have an apology on the table, which is a universal grammar of value is the context for what I would call a world spirituality, or even a world religion. But a world religion at context for our diversity. That's a critical sentence, not a homogenizing world religion, right? But a universal grammar of value as a context for our diversity. And the postmodern allergy to any kind of shared set of universals, to any kind of world religion, is not inappropriate. And there were 1,000 years of abuse of religion. But we got to stop this thing where we're in Portland or San Francisco or, some, place in Manhattan or someplace in, Great Britain, near, or someplace in, and we're going to kind of formulate a bunch of ideas that a very small sector, right, is engaged with. And we're going to ignore the rest of the world and think we've changed something. Actually, 60 to 70% of the world lives in a relationship to a classical religion. And the notion that we're going to actually, in this global moment, ignore religion or essentially, destroy it in our critiques and think that we're actually going to create something that heals the global intimacy disorder is just absurd. And so we very intentionally, Zach and myself and, Zach, Ken and I are talking a lot. We intentionally are renaming the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, because we think this is a critical moment where religion needs to be part of the story. Does that make sense, brother?
Yeah, well, it's
like, wow.
You want it to scale. And if only a bunch of philosophers and people who are really into books and mysticism are into these ideas, and it's not going to scale.
It's not going to scale. And it can't scale just from the United States. Our headquarters are in Belgium and Vermont. With Belgium and Vermont as our twin headquarters. We'd like to actually have a location in China. We're not there yet. But in other words, we've got to actually bring together, this can't be like another San Francisco Boulder move, imposed on reality. It's not going to work. We actually need to think, well, how do the Chinese think about AI? Zach and I are reading a book now about how the Chinese think about AI. That's interesting, right? How do right? What does great Russian literature of the 19th century say about value, right? And how do we actually incorporate Russia, not only ignoring the issue of Russia, Ukraine, which is a huge issue, and how we approach that. And I actually wrote a little book about that this year, but ignoring all that, right? We need to bring Russia to the table. And Russia's not Putin and however you understand Putin, but actually the great Russian literature of the 19th century is critical to world religion and Confucius and Lao Tzu, right? And the great Chinese, right? In other words, so we need everybody at the table. And this American notion is we need to bring the American Indians to the table, right? So yes, we should bring the American Indians to the table. Of course we should, but it's not about your local Aboriginals. There's a whole world out there. And actually everyone has a seat at the table. And then we need to synergize the leading edge validated insights of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern across wisdom streams, right, into a post-postmodern, right, new story of value, right, that actually we can explain to 100 truck drivers any place in the world.
So I want to get
if we can't, and truck drivers are very smart. Take it away.
I want to get into this new story of value, but for the earnest skeptics who are sitting at the edge of the table and who are hearing this and are like, okay, the universe is a love story. What's a way in which they can ground what you're saying in their first person experience?
Fantastic. Oh, I love that. Fantastic. That's a great, great inquiry. So in this new set of volumes coming out, kind of the 5-volume set on the universal love story, or in the Intimate Universe book, what we've done is we've actually articulated a series of equations, which I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let me give you just 3 doors in. Okay. So door 1, I'm going to simplest door to the most complex door. Door 1, music is an expression of the intimate universe. Right? Music actually comes into being in the manifest world. Music actually quite literally is us. We are music, and how that works is a broader scientific conversation, but we literally are music. And music is obviously universal, right, across space and time. And virtually all music is a love song. Interesting piece of information, right?
I was actually thinking about this today.
Music, right? Beautiful, right? Right. So Pythagoras talks about the relationship between music and the number, mathematics. And in some sense, music is, let me say it this way, music is the melody of the mathematics of intimacy. That's an empirical state, right? Music is the melody of the mathematics of intimacy. Just like systems theory, right, is the exterior system explanation of the mathematics of intimacy. And music and systems theory are 2 things we need to bring to the table, but you actually have a direct experience. You're sitting at your desk and a particular melody comes up and you're completely transfigured and transformed. And either you're raised up or you're cast down or you're blown open, or right. But why does it do that? Why does music do that? Because anthro-ontology, the music actually lives inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
The music actually is in you. The music is accessing the anthro-ontological reality that you participate in. And it's not by accident that the Oxford biologist, Dennis Noble, wrote a little book, a very good book called The Music of Life. He's trying to capture something. There's a text in the original canons of Hebrew wisdom, which reads, L'shifno tidrashu uvata shama. If you're searching for she, Shekhinah, right, the goddess or Eros, or the interior, Bata Shama, go to the temple or temple consciousness. And what's at the temple? The song of the Levites. Song, music. And so music, it's all love songs. Why? Why is it all love songs? That's a very hard piece of empirical information to explain away. So that's one. That's just one door in.
Can I just add to that?
Second door in. Please, take it away, brother. Please.
Because there's something subtle here that I think can be easily missed. Okay, let's make this really concrete. I listen to Vivaldi, and I'm moved. I'm moved to tears. A lot of people are as well. what is happening there, and how is Vivaldi a love song that is representing the language of intimacy?
What is intimacy? Let's that beautiful question. Let's take our next step. So I'm going to offer the intimacy equation that we've talked about for the last 4 or 5 years. And Zach and I just sat actually and formalized it. We spend like 2 days, actually trying to formalize the equation. So here's an early version of the intimacy equation. And we could talk about this, and hopefully maybe we will. We'll spend one entire, conversation about this equation, but now let's just put it on the table. And this is, decades in the making, and it's careful. But let me give you kind of a version that doesn't have too many terms and too much that's going to kind of lose anyone listening and saying, oh my God, right? But I'm going to give you a kind of a second simplicity version of E equals MC squared, okay? Meaning an interior science equation. So intimacy equals shared identity. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of relative otherness, with relative in brackets. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness, but relative otherness, relative in brackets, times, not plus, times. And I want to thank my brother, Daniel Schmachtenberger. Daniel, when I was first sharing with him this equation, Daniel suggested correctly to switch the plus sign to a times sign, right? Times mutuality of recognition, times mutuality of pathos or feeling, times mutuality of value, times mutuality of purpose. 4 times signs. So let's do it again. Intimacy equals, and this works. Here's what this gets completely crazy, Daniel. That's why this is a Darwin Freud level intervention in culture, right? Which is not a declaration. It's not cute. It's not a new age move. It's not a fundamentalist move, right? This is an interior, exterior science grounded move. And I've literally spent the last 20 years thinking about this sentence and looking at it right? So this works across economics, across attachment theory, right? Across, politics, across relationships, across subatomic particles. And we'll apply this at least in 1 or 2 ways. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of bracket relative and bracket otherness. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of relative otherness times mutuality of recognition times mutuality of feeling pathos times mutuality of value times mutuality of purpose. Now, as you can imagine, right, we're writing separate sections on each one of the terms of the equation because we need to look at each of the terms of the equation. But you begin to say, oh, okay. So intimacy equals shared identity. So here I am talking to Daniel. So who am I talking to? Am I committed to penetrating, sharing tenderly with reality, audaciously, cosmologic humanism? And, this dude Daniel writes me an email and he says, oh, he's an it in my game. Oh, he's got a podcast. So I'll have this conversation with him and we'll be able to share this, which is good for the world. That's a horror, actually. That means that we're fundamentally alienated instruments in each other's game, right? It's not, in your words, it's not an infinite game, borrowing from that book, right? No, it's actually not the case. No, I'm talking to Daniel, right? Who's an irreducibly unique expression of desire and intimacy. And he has a certain quality of intimacy about him, right? And now that we've talked our second talk, I'm never going to confuse Daniel's intimacy. This Daniel, let's say with my other friend Daniel. I'm not going to say, oh, which Daniel am I talking to? No, clear. And then in between us, the space in between us, that's that space in between the cherubs we talked about before, right? There's a new quality of intimacy that I've never experienced in my life before. This quality that lives between us in this moment, which will, with the grace of reality, the grace of she, which will deepen over the years. And I can't wait to have you here at the house with Zach, and we'll drink some wine and talk more deeply. But like, wow, I get to meet Daniel. And there's this quality of intimacy in between us that's new and it's nascent and we need to cultivate it. And so now stay close, we're a unique expression of the field of intimacy. Now remember, we said that divinity, God is the infinity of intimacy. So if that's true and you and I create in this meeting a new quality of intimacy, that means we just generated a new face of God. To that, I can only be in devotion. Who's Daniel? What does he love? What's interesting to him? What does he taste like? Right? What does he desire? Right? How does his mind work? Right? Right? Not because I want to marry Daniel. And I don't know if you have a partner or don't, I don't want them to get a little worried here. Well, it's bad, right? So, but here's the thing. We think that you can only talk that way about your romantic beloved. Mistake. That's ordinary love. That's love as a strategy of ego. Romantic love is a pale cast. It's beautiful. It's important, but it's one pale cast of the outrageous love, the evolutionary love that animates reality, and our love lists are too short. I actually, with your permission, get to love you. It doesn't mean we're going to get married. I'm not going to get a U-Haul. I don't know where you live, so you're not going to move there. You're not going to move here. That's not what love means. Love means we begin to realize, oh, we have a shared identity. Not Mr. and Mrs. That's what we think shared identity is. No. We're part of the same field together. We're part of the same field of value. We're not just separate selves. We're part of this true self field. But it's even more than that. And here's where it gets crazy and beautiful. We were allured to each other, not because we passed each other on the street, said, oh, who's that guy with the cool hair? Not for that reason, but because of all the human beings in the cosmos, a web of allurements brought us together. So we think that allurement worked for mitosis and meiosis. Then along came the noosphere, and then it stopped. Then it became a reductive, materialist, random world. That's fucking bullshit. It's scientific tripe. Right? It violates the essential logic of science. Oh, allurement's a quality of cosmos. Oh, it stopped at the end of the biosphere. Why? Oh, because everybody went home in the allurement department. Really? The Ministry of Allurement, right? Everybody went home. That's absurd. And there's lots of evidence for that. I'm not going to footnote that right now. But it's the reason we're talking to each other is allurement. Meaning you could trace the 10, 20, 30 allurements through your life and all the decisions you made that brought you to this moment and all that I made that brought me to this moment. And when we reduce them to their structure, they're not merely rational, although they have rationality. They're not merely, right, the vagaries of reason or the elegance of mathematics, right, which is itself allurement. It's deeper. There's an allurement, and clarified allurement guides my life. So I'm talking to Daniel because I'm allured. Who is this dude? Right? It's like, wow. Right? It's like, so that's exciting. That's the love story. So the love story is not, we exiled love fourfold. We said love is only, on Earth, and it's only between humans, and it's only a particular thing which we call romance, and it's only romance in the first stage of infatuation, right? In other words, so we've got this fourfold exile of love. And then when that doesn't work with one person in the same way forever, which happens to us along the way, generate sustained sexual attraction of the exact same kind for 50 years. If it doesn't do all of that, I'm fucked, and not in a good way. And so let me try and work out my life because I failed. What a tragedy. No. Reality is a love story. And allurement works between subatomic particles, protons and electrons and neutrons, and neutrons are, up quarks, down quarks, right? Protons and neutrons. And we've got electrons that come on board, and then they get together because they have a mutuality of recognition. And they can feel each other, mutuality of pathos. And they actually share a field of value, mathematical and an actual value. And then that creates shared purpose. So as these proton, neutrons, and electrons, they get together, they have a shared identity in the context of relative otherness, because protons, neutrons, and electrons don't disappear. And all of a sudden, we just applied the intimacy formula to Mark and Daniel, right? We have a shared identity in the context of otherness, right? Danielness doesn't disappear. And we recognize each other. We're just beginning, right? We can just beginning to feel each other. You're just beginning to kind of, what's our shared field of value, right? And then begin to have a shared purpose. But actually that same formula applies in a completely different way, because there's discontinuity and continuity. That's a phrase Zach and I use a lot in cosmologic humanism. There's what we call the principle of continuity and discontinuity, all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain, right? So the intimacy formula applies precisely to subatomic particles and to Mark and Daniel, but obviously in a very different way, different interior experiences, but it's the same formula. Whoa. for the first time, you get to actually be at home in the universe.
Mm.
Oh, universe, that's not a clever phrase. That's not an anti-scientific kind of, human potential movement, new age idea, or a religious idea of a particular system that's kind of hijacked intimacy and made it about its own system. No, it's the fucking structure of cosmos itself that lives in me. That's enchantment.
So I want to get back to Vivaldi, but first I want to amplify something you're saying here, which I think if you don't feel it, it's hard to know exactly what you're saying, because it's almost like fish not having a word for water. It's like we're the fish and we're swimming in the water, and the only word we have, well, the only words we have are for romantic love. And that's why when you were explaining this, you had to constantly say, look, love is not just about marriage. Love is not just about shared identity, is not just Mr. and Mrs. And it's because culturally, we don't have the language or the story of value to talk about something that I think everybody experiences on a regular basis, but they don't really have the words for it. So unfortunately, their reductionist minds tend to demystify and disenchant them with. And it's this thing of being like intuitively attracted or allured. You use the word allured, but just drawn to people, to things, to aspects of experience. And I'm going to give an example, and you tell me if I'm on the right track here. I'm in Lisbon right now, and I've been meeting a bunch of people, and they're like, I'm normally from Canada, from Toronto. And they're like, why did you come to Lisbon? And I had, all these reasons, like, oh, the weather's nice and stuff. But the reality was, I was allured for something, for an inexplicable reason. And so my answer now is, intuition. Because that's the honest truth. And not having some sort of rational argument for allurement is something I've become increasingly comfortable with, because I see it constantly in my life. I see things gleam out for me, and then I'm drawn to those things. And so I think people have this experience, they just don't have the words for it, and they only really understand it in the realm of romantic love. And what you're saying is that, no, this is what it means to be in this universe,
right?
To be human.
Beautiful. Yeah, so that's exactly right. In other words, let me try and say it this way. So it's 9/11. Let's go there. Okay. It's this horrific day in the United States. Twin Towers, go down, and how that happened is a great conversation and a different conversation. David Ray Griffin has written, the Whiteheadian scholar, some important work on that, but let's bracket that. People have, and they know it, they have minutes, maybe seconds to live. They have cell phones. They call a loved one. And they don't choose to call, they choose only to call a loved one, and they choose to say one thing. And we have the cell phone records that we recovered. They choose to say, I love you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I love you is our sacred creed. And the sacred creed is always, throughout history, the sacred creed is always what we say at the moment of death. So at our moment of death, we don't say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, which is a beautiful text, and we could talk about that text for hours. And we don't do the Lord's Prayer, and we don't do Om Mani Padme Hum, right? We actually, what we say is, I love you. So I love you has actually become our sacred creed. But, you remember Thucydides, right, in the Peloponnesian Wars, right? He writes, when words lose their meaning, culture collapses. So we've actually lost access to what I love you means, and I love you has grown stale. We don't know what it means anymore. We've exiled I love you, our sacred creed, to this very narrow cultural box where it collapses on itself. Because what we do is we try with one person in a kind of relatively unchanging way to fulfill all of the infinite love of cosmos, which is quite literally coded inside of my being. So all of that's inside of me. I try and live all of that, right? In other words, every muon and lepton and hadron. Let's start with gluons and quarks, and then, right, let's go up the chain, right? Subatomic particles, and then atoms, and then, early molecules, and then macromolecules, right? And then early cells, and then, right, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, right? Multicellular, then, early organisms, then, neural cord and neural net, right? All the way up the chain. All of these are a story about the evolution of love. All of these are held together by this quality, which is a central term in cosmoerotic humanism, this quality of allurement.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that allurement lives in Daniel. So, but here it is, right? But it doesn't live in Daniel in the exact same way it lives in Marc.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the first principles and values of cosmos is that opposites are joined at the hip, A. B, one of the opposites that are joined at the hip is sameness and uniqueness. So the reason we can have a conversation is because we are in many ways the same. So there's an entire field that we participate in mutually. And yet the reason the conversation is generative and exciting and alluring is because we're irreducibly unique. And that's what I've called unique self-theory. We talk about the irreducible uniqueness. That's a different conversation. We can have it at a different time. So when sameness and uniqueness generate a new field, which is a new quality of intimacy, which is animated by allurement, which is the quality of cosmos very far down and all the way up the evolutionary chain, we begin to have a vision of the intimate universe. And you're so right that actually we have no access to this. So one of the things we need to do in cosmoerotic humanism is lay down a new field of language. And one of the ways I've talked about that is evolutionary love. It's a term that, I wrote a short essay with Ken Wilber. We wrote a short essay that appeared based on some conversations we had, but that appeared at the end of the Unique Self book. But the term evolutionary love actually comes from Charles Sanders Peirce. He wrote an essay by the same name, a while before. But I'm not actually drawing from Peirce. Zach is a big Peirce reader. I'm not. Right? I'm drawing actually from two places. One is my own interior experience, but three. Two is the sciences. And three is the interior lineage texts of the leading edges of wisdom across traditions. I have a particular location in Aramaic texts. That's where I kind of live in the Aramaic world at one part of me. But this notion of, Solomon and the Song of Solomon, which is part of the original Hebrew canon, which is considered the most sacred book in the canon. Right? The text reads, Akiva, a master in the first century at the time of the temple's fall, writes, all the books are holy. The Song of Songs is holy of holies, sanctum sanctorum. And what is the Song of Solomon? It's a series of outrageous love notes between a lover and a beloved. So scholarship comes, Brother Daniel, and says, that's a tavern song. No, you motherfuckers. That's not right. Of course it's a tavern song. It's a tavern song because what every tavern sings about is love. Because actually that's the quality of cosmos. And what Solomon actually writes is Tocho Ratzuf Ahava. Its insides are aligned with love. Wow. So what is the Song of Songs? It's a series of outrageous love notes that tell a story between a lover and a beloved, but the way the lineage in its hidden text, not its exoteric text. So you could ask 1,000 rabbis, they wouldn't tell you this, but the inner text, right? The lineage text, it's very clear. This love story is not about just one lover and a beloved. This is reality. Reality is the lover and beloved. Its insides are aligned with love. Now, let's begin to merge that. And that's what, in this, what we're doing here is we're trying to articulate, we're trying to read molecular biology and trying to read genetics, right? And trying to read very, very carefully chemistry, right? And trying to read, economics across its 7 or 8 fields and trying to read the 11 basic schools of psychology, right? And now bring all this together in a second simplicity. What actually emerges is, holy shit, it's a love story. And that actually implicitly, without even realizing that they're saying it, all of these theorists are actually assuming that across the board. That's exciting. That's not, and that's why we're being so careful. we're being so careful, right? People have urged us to publish, brother, for the last 5 years, and we're going so slow and careful because we can't just declare this. And it's what you said. Oh, well, my listener here is reality is a love story. Really? Really? And there's a lot. I mean, we could have a series we're just at the very beginning of the conversation, but when we say reality is a love story, we're not being cute or clever. We're actually making what I think is the most accurate, validated, scientific statement, interior and exterior sciences, that we can make at this moment in history. So we got to talk about, well, how does that relate to evil? Okay, how does that relate to trauma, right? Those are all really important conversations which we can have. But in other words, this is an ontology of reality that's accessible as you inquire, Daniel. It's accessible to you directly. Yet you can actually directly access and just feel it in your body. What matters to you? Your love story. Why? Because the socio-cultural structure demanded it? No, there was always a love story. For a while, it was love of country, and then it was love of, right? But it's always been a love story. And if you actually trace history, sometimes it's an ethnocentric love story, right? Sometimes it's a religiocentric love story, but it's always a love story across cultures, across time, right? And my friend, Howard Bloom, who's a dear friend and a wonderful man, and he's a fellow at the think tank. So Howard, does the postmodern attack on this idea in his book, which is excellent, by the way, The Lucifer Principle. And Howard says, what are you making this shit up, man? Right? You're calling it love? Well, love means one thing 1,500 years ago and something completely different today. So the word doesn't even mean anything. And that's the postmodern critique of value. So that's where we have to articulate a new theory of value, which I referred to at the beginning of our conversation as evolving perennialism. And we said we need not just a new story, step 1, we need a new story of value, step 2, 3, a new story of value rooted in first principles and first values. And then step 4, a new story of value rooted in first principles and first values, evolving first principles and first values. Meaning love is real. Love is an ontology. And how love applies and expresses itself evolves, but there's a core understanding of love. And of course, we have an equation, an Eros equation, which addresses this, which is not for now. So we've got what we're trying to do, Mr. Zach and Mr. Mark, is we're trying to be precise. Right? We're trying to be, we're ecstatic and yet precise, right? In other words, we're doing an insane amount of work. Zach and I have been working on this for a decade, and we've hesitated. We're not right, slow, and people do right. And so even now, I mean, honestly, just if I can be just vulnerable for a second, I'm almost hesitant even in this conversation, right? And it's we're not quite ready, and we'll figure out how to release this in the right way and the right notes. We've got to be so careful. There's so much at stake.
Yeah,
we're in a meta crisis. This is not about some academic career. This is not about making a name. We're in a meta crisis, right? We're facing, right? We're poised between utopia and a potential imminent dystopia in which there could be no future, the death of humanity, or what I call the second kind of existential risk, the death of our humanity. And if we actually get seriously what we said in the beginning, that the only genuine response that's sufficient to the meta crisis is a new superstructure, a new story of value, then this is not being clever. This is not, let's have the think tank succeed. Fuck that. This is not, let's be major theorists, the new Darwins and Freuds. Fuck that. All that happens in the spiritual teaching philosopher world is this commodification of knowledge and this kind of egoic competition about who's the greatest thinker. Right? Like, really? We are not willing to play that game. Right? We got to play a larger game. Right? We got to get out of it. And literally the entire spiritual world and philosophical world is just another commodification of ideas, right? Which we then apply to rivalrous conflict and win-lose metrics. And if Gafni takes up too much space on the stage, which I always do, and people get mad, so let's shoot him down, right? And others, and I get right because right, and it's because we're in this rivalrous conflict, win-lose metrics. Fuck it. That is not where we are. We can't be there. We got to be something more. So Zach and I actually made a decision that we're actually going to publish, not even under our own names. We've actually come up with a shared name, which will be this new, this new, person, right? But this new expression that we can all pour into, right? Now, there's a series of 8 books that we want to express in that particular way through this name, right? David J. Temple. You ever met David? I met him once in Oxford a bunch of years ago, right? In other words, we've created this new person, but who, and when you think about it, friend, who wrote the Bible? We're not sure. Who wrote the Vedas? Not clear. Who wrote the Zohar in Hebrew wisdom? We actually don't know. New Testament, not clear. In other words, the real works that moved history actually had to transcend the egoic game.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got to be lovers. And I say this, but as a plea to listeners, like, we got to get, like, was that good? We got to get out of that. We got to step into this new story together and let ourselves be enchanted with our critical faculties intact, obviously. But we don't want to go pre-personal. We want to go personal plus, not personal minus. And actually, there's something exciting here, right? And, I mean this so gently, there's 10 podcasts I turned down and said yes to this one. And this is a compliment, if you can handle a compliment. Just in a sense, talking to Zach, oh, yeah, this is a good place. We'd like to land this here. And so this is a good place to have a conversation. And I'm delighted to be excited about you, right? Daniel's, right? He's got this beautiful gentleness and this incisive mind and this, sincerity, and yet this autonomy, right? So I get to be excited about you. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually beautiful. And here's a little shock. I get to love you. No, doesn't mean we're not sleeping together, right? Right. Not my type. Hair's too long, right? Right. Right. You got to keep repeating this so people get it. When I say it doesn't mean it means that we get to love each other. It's like, of course we do. What else would we do? Like that.
So I appreciate you saying all that. And for those who are listening and are persuaded sufficiently to practice something, for instance, you mentioned outrageous love as opposed to just ordinary love.
Ordinary love. That's the distinction. Outrageous love and ordinary love.
Yeah. What is something someone can do just at home with the people around them, with their relationship, with their experience, to get a better taste of this new story?
Let's start with the simplest. Here's the simplest thing to do, but it's very beautiful. And we've been doing this, a bunch of us, for about 20 years as a practice. Never receive service from someone whose name you don't know. Simple, right? You're at a restaurant. You're talking to a bank teller. You're on the street, right? Never receive service from someone whose name you don't know. Because name, and there's it's on this table here. There's a couple of volumes I wrote, back in the day, which are kind of the tracing of 2,000 years of Aramaic texts about proto-visions of what we're talking about here. And, in those texts, they're Aramaic Hebrew wisdom texts. Name is directly associated with irreducible uniqueness. So when I say your name, I see you. Right? For that moment, I see you. And when I kind of feel it in its most dramatic expression of eros, at the moment of sexual explosion, we say one of 3 things. We say, oh God, cross-culturally, oh God, or yes, or the name of the beloved. Right? And just a little rabbinic advice to anyone, don't get the name wrong, please. Right? Bad idea. Okay. So don't get confused. They're just advice. Right? So, and I joke about it just because we need just to break the intensity of it with a little laughter, because it's so intense. It's so beautiful. Because what we're realizing at that moment when we're on the inside of the inside, what the lineage calls lifnayo lifnim, the inside of the inside, umka de umka, the deepest of the deep. It's so deep, right? We can actually see. You actually are seeing your beloved with God's eyes. When you see your beloved with God's eyes, you actually realize they're an irreducibly unique expression of divinity. And so you cry out, oh God. And then you realize their essential goodness, and you actually experience, right, that radical yes that incepts reality, and you cry out yes. But then it's unique because love is a unique self-perception. You cry out their name. And so all of it, right, like, huh? Right, all of that is encapsulated ritually without crossing any boundaries of appropriateness in this very simple act. When there's a waiter or a waitress at the table, and you just stop for a second and say, yo, what's your name, man? And I've done this, 5,000 times, and never, my new friend Daniel, never has it not happened that the person just stopped and said, oh, right, Jack. Oh, Lily. And all of a sudden, the person appears.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's such a simple practice. What we're saying is, we're in a love story together. Now, we don't have to say the whole thing. So I wouldn't say, well, let's see if we can repeat that podcast with, Mark and Daniel. Bad idea. Right? But we're in this shared story. And we're characters in the story, and we're not its. We're not instrumented. Right? The MIT Media Lab, Alex Pentland talks about instrumenting people. It actually comes from Skinner, right, in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 1971. And Zach and I are just finishing a book called Techno-Feudalism, where we talk about this move to instrument people. So it's the de-instrumentation, right? It's the move from the measurable to the immeasurable, right? We get to actually be, and here's the crazy thing, we get to be sincere to each other, with each other, and we get to be, and I know this is going to be like a little bit, again, uncomfortable word, but I want to, with permission, put it on the table anyways. We get to be in devotion to each other. Right? And, for us, devotion is like a booby prize, right? When someone's not talented, we say, but he's a very devoted father, or he's a very devoted, right? And others, very devoted is like a booby prize in society. So again, I'm not suggesting you be devoted to your waiter, obviously, but there's a moment, what devotion means, there's a moment when I bracket my egoic self, I step out of instrumenting, and I just see you and I'm blowing open, and I'm like, oh my God, you're beautiful, right? And at the risk of being shocking, and becoming controversial, because of course I'm a very uncontroversial character, so we wouldn't want to be controversial in any way, right? But I mean, Daniel, I fall in love with people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
All the time. Right? How can you not? Right? We did an event a bunch of years ago called Success 3.0. And the board chair of the center at the time was John Mackey, who's a beautiful man who founded a little company in the States called Whole Foods, a grocer. And, he built 365 stores. And we were talking about love a lot and about the universal love story at those series of talks. And, the board chair of the center at the time, Kate Maloney, and I and John, were working together. And there was a certain moment we were talking about this universal love story, and we were putting this into the space. And John and I just looked at each other and said, oh my God, I love you. Right? But not in a kind of weird way, right? Not in a kind of like this pseudo intimate, saccharine, not at all. It was the only sincere expression of the interiority of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean we stopped disagreeing about things? No. Does it mean we gave up our autonomy? No. Does it mean we gave up our personhood? No. No, devotion and autonomy live together. So, I mean, I know we got a couple of minutes left. So what I'm actually thinking about in this moment, I'll be slightly self-revelatory. I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about, wow, I really enjoyed talking to Daniel. B, I'm thinking about, wow, how should this podcast be put out? And how do we make sure to create a transcript so these ideas are kind of clarified, before the books are out? Those are the first two things I'm thinking. But the third thing I'm thinking is, they're all happening at the same time in my mind, is, wow, I want to know more about Daniel, and how can we at the center be in devotion to whatever his life vision is? Right? How can we be in service to that? And that's literally what's going through my mind in this second. And because, well, here's this new world called Danielness, and allurement brought us together. So like that.
Oh, I really appreciate that. And there's like 50 million things I want to respond to now, but we're coming to the end of our time. Yeah, that practice, I really want to highlight that. I think that really touched me when you shared that. Of like, I'm going to order coffee differently from now on, and I really like how it's contrasting the existing story of capitalist transactions where we instrumentalize each other in a place of service. But Marc, I'll leave it to you. Do you have any last words for the listeners?
Permission? I just want to, if I can, finish with how we started. Just
Please.
A couple of supers, right? And I've just enjoyed being in your living room, and thank you for inviting me in. And Zach's intuition was correct, right? And I'm appreciating Zach in this moment. There's always a new name of God. 1, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. 2, the new name of God, the infinite intimate. 3, God not only is the infinity of power, God is the infinity of intimacy that both holds reality and adheres in reality. 4, 5, reality is not merely a fact, reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story, reality is a love story. Reality is not an ordinary love story, reality is an evolutionary love story. Reality is an outrageous love story. 5, and your story is chapter and verse in the universal love story. And finally, 6, and what's the plot line of the story? The progressive deepening of intimacies, the evolution of intimacy. And 7, and how do you know? An enormous amount of sciences we can bring to the table. But let's say it simply now, anthro-ontological method. Check inside. What drives you? The movement from loneliness to loving, from alienation to integration, right? The movement towards deeper and wider intimacies, not only between persons, but between truth, goodness, beauty, and all dimensions of your life. Can I be intimate with reality? And then finally, 7, to remember that you, we are reality's unique intimacies. So there's a way in which you can be intimate with reality that no one that ever was, is, or will be other than you can do. And without your stepping into reality and loving reality open with your unique quality of intimacy, that dimension of reality suffers and remains closed. So you're actually needed. 8, last sentence, you're needed by all of existence. Maybe need we'll talk about in our next conversation. Thank you, man.
Thanks so much for this conversation.
Ciao.